Continued talk about the storm while it continues to batter the East Coast. President Trump, though, not backing down from his claim that Alabama faced a serious threat from Hurricane Dorian. He's tweeted 9 times about Alabama, including several maps. Even the White House released a statement defending the president's claim. Yesterday afternoon, the president tweeted maps from August 29th and August 30th, writing, "Just as I said, Alabama was originally projected to be hit. The fake news denies it," he writes. He went on to say, "I was with you all the way, Alabama. The fake news media was not." Here is what Shep Smith of Fox News had to say about that yesterday.
Why would the President of the United States do this? He decries fake news that isn't and disseminates fake news that is. This is one where he can apologize and just move on. That map was from the day hurricane became a hurricane, 8 days ago, August the 28th. It was 4 days old at the precise time he said Alabama would likely be hit harder than anticipated. And by then, it was fake news defined on a very serious subject. Yet he forged on. This morning, another statement. What I said was accurate. It wasn't, and it isn't.
And according to CNN's Jake Tapper, President Trump called a Fox News correspondent into the Oval Office yesterday to argue that he was not wrong about Alabama. According to Jake Tapper, Fox News senior White House correspondent John Roberts was beckoned to the Oval Office yesterday afternoon. In an internal Fox News email obtained by CNN, Roberts wrote that Trump, quote, stressed to me that forecasts for Dorian last week had Alabama in the warning cone. He insisted that it is unfair to say Alabama was never threatened by the storm. According to Tapper, Roberts' analysis of the meeting was that the president was just looking for acknowledgement that he was not wrong for saying that at some point Alabama was at risk, even if the situation had changed by the time he issued the tweet. Sunday morning, that was. Roberts did not immediately respond to CNN's request for a comment. Joe, I have to say I've been away for a little bit on vacation, blissfully unplugged, and to come back yesterday and to see that the President of the United States is still talking about a map and a doodle he drew about a hurricane that was coming, not to Alabama, that the forecast was changed, that he's still insisting upon being right about something he was so clearly wrong about, is stunning and a little bit baffling.
Well, it is. It's also, of course, disturbing. There's so many things that happen, and I think a lot of us, I think you and I have gotten to the point where we roll our eyes on most of these tweets. Yeah. But here, you're actually talking about a hurricane. The president tweeted out that residents of Alabama needed to be worried at a point when they didn't. So, of course, that causes a lot of concern, so much so that the government has to set out a clarifying statement. I thought more disturbing was that last night was a night when people in South Carolina and North Carolina and now Virginia were either getting hit by the hurricane or having to prepare for the hurricane. Those states, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And I have been inside my house with the windows and doors boarded up and hunkering down. And it's really frightening. You don't know what tornadoes are going to spin off. You don't know where they're going to go. You don't know how your community is going to be ripped apart. And while at that precise moment, the President of the United States wasn't talking about South Carolina or North Carolina or Virginia.
It's incredible.
He was talking about Alabama, a state that was never in any danger and certainly was at least, as Shep Smith and Fox News said, 4 days removed from any danger by the time he tweeted his tweet. And, you know, David Ignatius, again, so much of this is just farce. And I've gotten to the point, I don't pull my hair out at the ignorance and the nonsense. But in a case like this, he panicked people in Alabama. Now he's lying about it. And he's doing that instead of doing what every president that I ever dealt with during these storms, whether it was Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or governors like Lawton Childs or Jeb Bush. I mean, when those storms were about to hit shore, all of their attention and focus was on protecting the people that were in the path of the storm. Donald Trump, bizarrely enough, was focused on a Sharpie doodle that he had done several days before. And there are, of course, the whole world is watching. There are consequences in Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and across the world that our leader seems this detached and this unstable emotionally.
You know, Joe, the thing about Sharpie Gate, as we've been calling it, is that it offers a remarkable psychological insight into the president and what makes him tick. Anybody makes a mistake. He got it wrong the first time around about Alabama. It's understandable, apparently, in that he'd seen some earlier reporting and apparently confused it in his mind. That happens to people, even presidents. But then you move on. This obsessive attempt to keep relitigating to the point of summoning a reporter, John Roberts, to the White House to make his case. Taking this and making it the only story that today we're focusing on illustrates the self-destructive way this president operates. It's mystifying to me. This was one where you just, you make a mistake, you move on. Our colleague John Meacham has made that point in comments he's made over the last 24 hours. Donald Trump is different. He's got to be right about everything. If he feels like he's been, humiliated by being caught in a lie, it's the fault of the fake news media, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, you just got to watch it and shake your head.
It's incredible. It is self-destructive. You see him, Joe, talking about, for example, when you get into his head, you know that he sees the value of even negative coverage of talking about Pence staying at a Trump property, not Doral, bedbugs, but the other one in Ireland. And you know that every time that story is covered, Trump is happy because at least it's press coverage for a brand of his. But with this, I have no idea what his end game could be when he continues to prove that he was completely wrong.
Well, it's not an end game. And Sam Stein, I've always said that because Donald Trump surprised the mainstream media in 2016 with his unorthodox campaign, his terrible campaign in many ways, there's always this assumption that he's got this magic, this voodoo, that we just don't understand the strange ways of Donald Trump and that he is playing three-dimensional chess. No, he's not playing three-dimensional chess. These are the moments that you realize he stares at the board, he picks up a pawn, puts it in his mouth, and starts eating it. That's where we are. All of this does not accrue to his benefit. As he digests all of the chess pieces, you realize when it hits his stomach, it's bad news. It's bad news for him. This is more bad news for Donald Trump in a terrible summer.
I'm trying to go along with this imagery, but I don't know how to advance it. But I do agree with you. I was talking with Susan before we started the show about whether there was something he was trying to distract from. Maybe it's transferring money to his border wall from military bases, something that is more politically problematic. And my position is, if he's trying to distract, if he's trying to deflect, this is the worst job at deflection or distraction you could possibly do, because he looks pathological. He looks like someone who, if your uncle were doing this, you would say, oh my God, he has a real problem. 9 tweets, 5 different maps, an inability to just let something so minor go, and to do so at a time when, one, the hurricane is hitting the U.S. mainland, which is obviously something that a president should be attentive to. But two, and I don't want this to get lost, a generational storm has just completely obliterated and wiped away the Bahamas and caused a mass amount of human suffering, including a death count that's likely to shock us. For a president to not show a modicum of empathy or attention to that because he's obsessively drawing Sharpies on old maps is a bizarre thing to witness, and it's a bad political development for him too. So I don't think he's distracting, because if he was trying to distract, he would be doing something else other than this.
Joe, I agree with you and Sam. I think there's a tendency these days to overthink what President Trump is doing or saying. He can't be wrong. We've known this about him for how long? He's embarrassed that he was very wrong. Now he's the president of the United States, so when he is wrong, it has real ramifications. It has impact, as you know, for the people of Alabama who may have thought they were going to be getting a storm their way. The National Weather Service in Birmingham came out 20 minutes after his first tweet on Sunday and said, no, the storm's not coming here. He has to dig in deeper and create this chasm between two sides, those who are with him and those who are against him, even on a tweet where he was patently and clearly and demonstrably wrong. He has to dig in. He can't be wrong, even though everyone knows he is, because it's sitting in plain sight in this case.
Yeah, you know, Mika, in most cases, I mean, well, in every case except for Donald Trump, the strange case of Donald J. Trump, if the National Weather Service comes out 20 minutes later and corrects what you said, then you don't fight it for another week. You go, oh, you know what? I was looking at old maps, thinking of old maps. Sorry about that. Just can't do it. And it's something that he told us from the very beginning, that he just can't say he's sorry. He's too insecure to do it.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.